We began just a couple weeks ago a study of the book of James. We're in our third week, and on the fourth verse. Now that's not a precursor of things to come, you know. I know I get joked about the 2.5 years we spent in the book of Corinthians, but this book really is packed. We began the study a couple weeks ago. In case you missed the introduction, we're calling our study Viable Faith. That word viable communicates the authenticity of the kind of faith, the practical living kind of faith that we find in this book. And as I did in the introduction, I just want to make note that as James writes to believers, mostly Jewish converts, he talks about those brethren that are scattered. He's addressing real life circumstances that you and I face every day, difficulties in life. In fact, the passage we looked at last week, he says, "Consider it pure joy, my brethren, when you face various trials. For people live through things, knowing that the testing of your faith develops endurance." That word endurance we talked about last week can also be the word perseverance. Sometimes it's translated patience. But as we looked at last week, the fact that we go through, not if we go through, but when you go through it. When you face things in life that are going to shape you and mold you to see whether or not your faith is viable, if it's legitimate, if it's grown up. That's what he's saying. When these things come, it's a test of what kind of faith you have, really. In fact, our text today, verse 4, picks up with that idea. Remember the word perseverance, patience, those are interchangeable here. Verse 4, our text today picks up and says, that perseverance, that comes from the tests that God allows, that perseverance must finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. Now I want to focus on that, but I want to mention something that I didn't mention last week. It's important to understand about the word that has to do with testing here. Some translations you might find the word trial. Some might use the word test in that regard. It's interesting, the words are somewhat interchangeable, but we differentiate. One translation actually uses the word temptation. It's interesting, in the Greek word for temptation, the one that's translated for trial, the one that's translated for test is actually the same word. And I want to ask you to consider that just a moment, because certain things we go through are trials, and certain things we go through are tests, and certain things we go through are temptations. And what differentiates between those things? Well, it seems the Bible indicates clearly that the difference is the desired outcome. What's the desired outcome? Because you see, you face a circumstance. Let's just pick something that might happen to you. Let's say someone pulls out in front of you, and you don't have time to stop. And you have a fender bender, but clearly it wouldn't have happened had they not pulled right out in front of you. Now, I don't know what that is for you. For most of us, that's a temptation. Yes, that's right. For most of us, it's a temptation to respond, to get upset, to get irritated. What were you thinking about? You blind? Did you take your test in Braille? I'm just serious. You think, well, how could you miss that? Well, because people get distracted. You say, well, what if you knew they were texting? Would it be a test, or would it be a temptation? You see, the desired outcome generally shapes what the test is about, or what kind of experience it's going to be for us. It's all kinds of things like that. We go through a physical struggle. And everyone has them from time to time. You go through something where you struggle, you don't feel well, you're sick, whether it's a shoulder, that's out of place, or a knee problem, or a back problem. Everyone experiences it. Well, is it a test? Or is it a trial? Or in the midst of it, are you tempted? Well, the Bible makes it clear. We're going to look at a passage in actually a few weeks, maybe a few months, depending how it goes, where it says God is not here to tempt anybody. God doesn't tempt anyone, nor is he tempted. See, the purposes of God in our life are not that we have trials to find out whether or not we're going to face the temptation to what? To act out in the flesh, to face the temptation to act out in some way that would be inappropriate, or to be angry and go off on someone and to try to take things in your own hands. See, God's purposes for difficulties and testing is that our faith, listen, our faith would be tested just like Job. And the purpose of that test is what? That we would be proven mature. That we would become complete. And being able to endure things. And then ultimately, as our text today says, being satisfied. Not wanting for anything. Lacking nothing. Now, with that thought in mind, let's go back to our text. Perseverance. Remember, perseverance is what you go through when you face things. But I want to begin with the terminology this morning, godly perseverance, the first point. Godly perseverance is the path to spiritual maturity. And you say, well, why do you have to call it godly? Because you can persevere on your own apart from God. That's why. Now, I don't know everyone here real well personally, but my wife can give you a testimony that I'm one of those folks that I like to think of as being strong-willed. Now, throughout 25 years of our marriage, she's used other words. Other words that are synonymous with being strong-willed are stubborn, like a donkey. And because I see you looking around with each other, and folks like that, right? That you can persevere on your own. You don't need any help from nobody. And you kind of just bow your neck a little bit and you say, okay, is that how it's going to be? Bring it. You see, we can persevere apart from God. And that's why we need to differentiate what James is writing about, this viable kind of faith that God ultimately allows to be tested because he wants us to experience completeness and satisfaction. That kind of faith is only developed through godly perseverance, which is the path to spiritual maturity. And I want to look at what that means this morning a little bit. The best commentary in the Bible is always the Bible. That's why as we go through one text, you find all these other verses in there, because the Bible explains itself. Now, commentaries are great. I have a lot of them. I read a lot of text criticism and things, but the best way to understand the Bible is by knowing more about the Bible. And the Bible describes how we have this relationship with God that develops godly perseverance that ultimately allows us to become spiritually mature. And in every definition, every description you see, it begins the same way. Jesus made it clear. In the Sermon on the Mount, he laid the foundation for what it means to become a follower of Christ, to enter in this relationship. Everybody comes to God the same. You come like a child or you don't come at all. I love the simplicity of it. That passage in Matthew, it's also in Luke as well. When he gathered the children together, and he had the children there as the object lesson, he was talking to the grown-ups. But he said to the grown-ups, unless you come to the kingdom of God like one of these, you don't come at all. You come to God to begin this process of spiritual maturity like a child. Jesus said it a little bit differently in John chapter 3. He says, I tell you the truth, no one can see the kingdom of God unless you're born again. Meaning, you have to start over. And when you are born, you don't come into the world as an adult. You come into the world as a child. And they says, you may be fully grown. That's what confused people. They said, well, how can a person enter the mother's womb again? You can't grown up. The only way you're born again is like a child, an infant. Mark chapter 10, verse 15. Jesus says this way, I tell you the truth, no one will receive the kingdom of God unless they come like a little child. You will never enter into it. So in order to become a grown-up spiritual person, you got to begin like a child spiritual person. Now, we could spend a lot of time talking about what that means, but I think the first thing we'd recognize under point 1, that children are totally helpless. And this is, again, a spiritual principle throughout the Bible. If you want to become mature and complete, not wanting for things, not being satisfied by other things, but only God, you begin like being a child. And children are totally helpless.